One more method we need to know with solving quadratics is called the square root method. So solving quadratics with the square root method. If you think back to our our factoring lesson, there was almost always two different powers of x. So there was, I think there was always, in fact, there was always an x squared and an x to the first. Now if you look at this first example here, there's just one power of x. There's just an x squared. There's not another x floating around somewhere. So that's how you can know that you don't have to factor, that you can instead use the square root method. Okay? With the square root method, you just want to try to get the x by itself. So for example, with this first one, I just need to divide both sides by 4. That gives me x squared equals 5. And then I take the square root of both sides. The main thing you need to remember here is when you take the square root, you have to write plus or minus the square root of 5. And we're just going to leave it as the square root of 5. I don't want a decimal. You don't need to approximate it. Just leave it as the square root of 5. So when you do the square root, make sure you put plus or minus in front of it. So same idea on this next one. 3x squared equals 21. We just have x squared. There's not another x floating around. There's just one x in this whole problem. But it does have a squared on it. So we needed to get it by itself. Divide both sides by 3. You get x squared equals 7. And then we take the square root of both sides. And we get x equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Now this may be obvious to most of you, but I want to make sure I explain exactly why we're taking the square root. Okay, if you look back at this original problem, 3x squared equals 21, we had to get rid of the 3. It was 3 times x squared. So it was 3 times we were multiplying. So to get rid of that 3, we had to divide. So to get rid of something, we do the opposite of it. If we were doing 3 times x, to get rid of that, we were multiplying, we have to instead divide. Okay, so that brought us down to x squared. So just like you need to do the opposite, instead of multiplying by 3, you divide by 3. Here we were squaring the x. So to get rid of that square, we had to do the opposite. And the opposite of squaring something is square rooting it. So just like dividing by 3 canceled out the 3, square rooting the squared canceled out the squared. Okay, this is another way these might look. Now I know the x isn't directly squared, like there's not a squared right here, but it's still just one x in the problem, and there is a squared that applies to it. So, in this case, we are already ready to take the square root, because we need to get rid of that squared first. We can't add this 2 over until we get rid of that squared because of our order of operations. Okay, so we got to get rid of that squared so we can get at the x. So we get rid of the squared by using a square root. So I get x minus 2 equals plus or minus the square root of 6. And then I add 2 to both sides. Again, we just do the opposite. It was x minus 2, so we are subtracting 2. So to get rid of it, we had to do the opposite, which is add 2. So that gives us x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 2. Now just so you know, you can write it plus or minus the square root of 2 plus 2. That's just not normally how people do write it. So in other words, that's not mathematically incorrect, but just kind of by math etiquette or by convention is what most people would say, we would not write it that way. We usually put the plus or minus in between the two pieces, not at the front. Okay? Now, this last example, x plus 5 squared minus 11 equals 0. Again, we need to get x by itself. We know to use the square root method because there's only one x that's showing up in this whole problem. So I add 11 to both sides, and I get that. Then I need to get rid of the squared, so I square root both sides. And I get x plus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 11. Please, please, do not forget this plus or minus. And then I subtract 5 from both sides. So I get x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 11. And that's my answer. Now if you would prefer, you can actually write it two ways. You can write x equals negative 5 plus square root of 11 and x equals negative 5 minus square root of 11, because we do have two answers. One's the plus, one's the minus, but it's fine to just write the plus or minus. But just in case the back of the book or a multiple choice question or anything like that lists it separately, that is the same thing. Okay, there's also some practice for this on page 128 if you need it.